Now, the last of these videos for this session on international peace and security really takes its cue from the so-called Amadown document, the Rethinking Security document. And the Amadown document discusses what it calls the dominant security paradigm and the narrative that goes with it. And it's talking about the UK, but really its observations could apply much more widely. And what it says is the dominant security paradigm is supported by a narrative of a virtuous nation, as it were, kind of tootling along in the world, minding its own business. And suddenly there crops up this security threat, almost like a bolt from the blue. So here's a couple of the things it says on one of the slides. The dominant security paradigm identifies these threats, of course, including international terrorism today, which is the link from what we were just discussing. And it argues for maintaining military capabilities at a level to permit these threats to be neutralized by force. But that ignores various aspects. One of the things it ignores is the long-term underlying reasons for the occurrence of these threats, and that would entail delving into issues of justice and structural violence, as we know. But it also, as the report puts it, it ignores deeply harmful actions by Western powers from colonial times to the present day as a factor in creating those threats. And that may really be the key, I think, to developing a peace perspective, not the only one, of course, but a peace perspective on international peace and security. That if the dominant security threat, the dominant security paradigm identifies threats to our security as occurring as if out of the ether, and just having to be neutralized, then a peace perspective may say, well, in fact, actually, the world we meet is a world that is, at least in part, one of our own making. So we need to examine our part in the sequence of cause and effect that leads to the emergence of these security threats. And one of the areas that would come under close scrutiny, therefore, would indeed be these harmful actions by Western powers. One of them, of course, in recent times being the invasion of Iraq. And that's one of the issues that I discuss in one of the readings for this week, talking about the recent Chilcot inquiry into the UK's part in that particular escapade. Let's have a little look at some of the issues there. And the Chilcot inquiry locates in the insurgency that followed the fall of the Saddam Hussein regime the roots of the present problem with ISIS, the other ISIS, Islamic State, and the security threat posed by that. Tony Blair, the then British Prime Minister, testified to the inquiry that he was indeed warned that it would make Britain a terrorist target, but he decided to press ahead because, as he put it, there are ample justifications such terrorists will use as excuses. Now that's to collapse a crucial distinction. That we may feel that, of course, we wouldn't want to excuse or justify terrorism, but that shouldn't stop us from seeking to explain it and to understand where it came from. Islamic State can be seen as having taken root and started to grow in the scorched earth left behind by our invasion of Iraq. And indeed, elsewhere in the article, I discussed testimony to that inquiry by the former head of MI5, who joins some of those dots. Now, what else we got here? I also contributed an article to the Current Peace Rights, which is about the extraordinary persistence of this dominant security paradigm, even in the face of the evidence, not only in actual security think tanks and ministries and so forth, but also in the media. And the BBC coverage that I examined after the Paris attacks last November is some of the findings summarised there. That I discuss the blowback effect. Blowback, as I explained, was a CIA term for the unintended consequences of foreign policy, and you could say the emergence of Islamic State is a good example of that. Whereas even though that is taken as a staple scholarly analysis of the problem of Islamic State, it was virtually excluded from this chunk of BBC coverage. So that's an example of how dominant this security paradigm is, the absolute disavowal of our own part in creating the problems we now face in Britain, but also many other places, such as Australia. Australia published its defence white paper earlier this year. There's the Prime Minister launching it, and it commits Australia to military spending of 2% of GDP within a few years, which is a very high level, on the rationale that Australia is particularly concerned by the unprecedented pace and scale of China's land reclamation activities. And it goes on to justify a partnership with the United States, where there's ever more military exercises and joint working going on. And what it misses out, of course, is the same kind of factor. Why is China engaging in these land reclamation activities? Why is China evincing these signs of nervousness? Could it be something to do with this pattern revealed in a map circulated at the time by a peace group, and their statement is also on the Blackboard site, showing the red stars there as the US or US allied military bases facing China. And you could join the same kind of dots around the other side of China as well, to show that China really is encircled by what it might consider as hostile military deployments. You may feel that you might wish to imagine the situation reversed. How would we feel in Australia if Australia was surrounded by hostile military deployments? Would we seek to do similar things to those that China is doing now? So that may be the key to at least a peace perspective on matters of international peace and security, that we are in a community. Everything we do redounds and reverberates through that community of nations, which is felt at various different levels, and therefore it would behoove us to behave ourselves in a fashion on the basis of the golden rule, do as you would be done by, because the problems we will face in the security domain in the future are linked with our actions of today and indeed our actions of the past.